Well, welcome everyone to our third Global Learning at Lunch. And this series is focusing on intersections of health, wellness, and spirituality. And if you have been able to join us the previous sessions, we talked about health and wellness, and especially dietary restrictions in Judaism. And then we talked about dietary restrictions and fasting in Islam. And today we get to talk about intersections of health and wellness in Christianity. And I am, if you don't know me, my name is Dr. Courtney Brentz, and I'm an associate dean. My background is in religious studies, specifically Buddhist studies. You can see the mandala over here on the wall. But I am joined today by Reverend Eduardo Busan, who is the minister at Nebraska Wesleyan University. So first of all, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And I always have a handout. So I'll add that into the chat, and I'll be admitting folks as they come in. So I'll add that one more time. So if you're just joining us, I'm going to add the handout for today's panel into the chat. And this just kind of guides our conversation. It provides some extra resources if you want to know more. All right, so we've added the handout into the chat, and if you're just joining us, I'm joined by Reverend Eduardo Busan, who's the minister at at Nebraska Wesleyan. You're thinking, did you give me a job change? No. So how today will work is, especially if you're joining us for the first time, is I have a series of questions to ask, and then there's time for audience questions at the end, and we'll be done by 1. And so so thank you again so much for joining me. And this is our first time virtually or ever meeting, because we know common people, but just haven't crossed paths. So much for giving us your time today. So I just wanted to start off by asking you a little bit about, could you tell us a little bit about your background, how you got into ministry, and how you came to be at Nebraska Wesleyan?
Sure. Thanks, Courtney. Yeah, I appreciate so much this invitation. It is great to be with you all, friends. And I'm actually in the chapel at Nebraska Wesleyan, and I'm standing because I've been sitting for so long. And Courtney, please help me out here, because I'm in the chapel, I'm standing, and I'm a preacher. So if I need to, I'll try to be succinct in my answers. But again, I'm very honored and very grateful for the opportunity to visit with you all about Christianity and wellness. I'm originally from Puerto Rico. I don't know if you all know Jose Soto, but we're compatriots. And every time we get together, we enjoy speaking Puerto Rican to each other. I was born and raised there, and oddly enough, and I say that because most Christians in Puerto Rico are Catholic, but I was not born in the Catholic Church. I was actually born and raised in the Methodist Church. Since 1898, with the invasion or the Spanish-American War and the invasion of Puerto Rico, many of the mainline denominations came to set flag in Puerto Rico, and the Methodist it was one of those. So born and raised there, Methodist. When I was fairly young, going into middle school, I had the opportunity at church to give a message for the Christmas Eve service, and I didn't think it was a big deal. but everyone at church thought it was a big deal. And one of the really cool things that I have learned about my church is the nurturing spirit that they had, particularly with folks that they, well, with everyone, the nurturing aspect of vocational discernment with every one of their children, youth, young adults. So they identified me as someone that may have the gifts to be a preacher. So even though I wasn't even in middle school, they began to nurture that and to help me discern if that was what God was calling me to do. Um, any of you who are related to Ignatian spirituality know that there are two aspects of the call. There's the internal aspect and the external aspect, and sometimes one comes before the other. But at the time of responding to the call, both have to be together. Um, and in my case, it was that external witness, as we call it in Methodism. And as I was growing and exploring, um, I by the time that I was entering college, I knew that I was going into seminary. So, so one of the things that I did in college, in university, the University of Puerto Rico, was be very involved in campus ministry, and I'm very grateful for that experience. They were able to provide for me that campus ministry, something that the church couldn't, which was ministry with peers, with people of my own age, and leadership with people with my own age. So it was a huge part of my discernment. So in Puerto Rico, um, the church is not a wealthy church. The Methodist Church is not wealthy. So anyone who has been identified to be a pastor will go to a church. So I didn't really have a sense that I had other options.
Mhm.
So when I came to Kansas City for seminary, I had in my head that I was going to be a pastor for a local church, and I did that. I did that for 8 years. Um, yeah, for 8 years or so. Um, but I also discovered that Methodism in the mainland, we have pastors can also be campus ministers, and I didn't know that. So I began to explore that a little bit. And about 13 years ago, I talked with my bishop and said, "Hey, if there's an opportunity at a campus ministry, please send me there." And so they did send me to Washburn University in Topeka, and I was there for 4 years. And as the campus minister, as a Methodist campus minister at, at Washburn University, and I completely loved it. It was such a life-giving experience, and I think that we all can relate. That sometimes we do some things that are not really fulfilling or life-giving to us, but then we find that something else that is like a treasure um, that was hidden in plain sight, and all of a sudden we feel alive. So that's what happened to me. I was doing okay in the local church, but started doing campus ministry, and my gosh, my world was turned over for the better. Um, my wife is also a pastor, so we ended up in Lincoln because her um, um, the bishop had appointed her to a ministry here in Lincoln, actually at the conference office that used to be here in Lincoln, the conference office for the Methodist Church, for the United Methodist Church. And about that time, the position here was open. The minister was leaving to go somewhere else. And so I applied and they hired me, and I've been here almost 9 years. So oof, that's a story of what is Eduardo doing at Nebraska Western University. Um, and that's that's how I came here. A combination of God opening doors and following my vocation, and discerning what it is that God uh, wants to continue to do with my life.
That's fantastic. And how powerful to explore that and to think about that external and that internal component.
Right.
If you're just joining us, I am so grateful to be with Reverend Eduardo Busan, who is minister at Nebraska Wesleyan. In the chat, I've included our handout for this week, which also includes the dates of John Wesley, because part of whenever I teach about the history of Christianity, it's so many dates and how did things come about. So I wanted to make sure that folks kind of have a sense of when Methodism came about. And part of this series is that, we can't cover all components of every tradition within the religious tradition that we're talking about. And so representing United Methodist Church, are there some essential kind of practices or beliefs or kind of identity components that you think are really kind of foundational to UMC that we should know about?
Yes. And there are so many different Methodist churches. There's a United Methodist. There is the which there are a few here around town. There are three Methodists, which there's also one, at least one here in town. There are African Methodist Episcopal churches, which I know there's Queen Chapel. Methodists and at one point or another have split, like churches do. So I like to speak of Wesleyan theology because most of the things that will answer your question, Courtney, will be similar or among all of these different Methodist denominations. Now, when we talk about polity and structure, that's why we have split. But related to doctrine, so to speak, in practices, we are very, very similar. And I like to talk about four things or five. The first one is there is Methodism began as a renewal movement within the Anglican Church in the 18th century. And so there was not much of new doctrines developed, but what was particular about Methodism was the practice of Christianity. So one of the things that John Wesley insisted that we still do today is the preeminence of love as a rule of the Christian life. One of the things that John Wesley says is in one of his sermons was that, you're all asking about what is a Methodist, but let me tell you, do you love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength? Do you love your neighbor as you love yourself? Then we are the same. And that's really that was the purpose of Methodism, was to infuse both a piety and a sense of social responsibility in the Christian. And that's still who all of us are today. So the first thing that I would that I would think that that when people ask me what is a Methodist, I say is someone that embraces that personal piety by loving God with all heart, mind, soul, and strength, and social holiness by loving neighbor as oneself. A Methodist is someone that understands and receives the grace of God as a grace that has been pursuing us since the day we were born, that will continue to pursue us until our last breath. A Methodist is someone that I have my notes here. That is also very, very practical. Methodists, we're known to be very practical. and we speak of practical divinity. We even have a name for that, for that, um, which is reflected in the rules of a Methodist. This is something that I think is really cool. And Courtney, you may find, I would love to have a conversation with you over the rules of being a Methodist, because I have a theory. Um, and it's this. John Wesley said, a Methodist, in order for you to be Methodist, it's about love, it's about grace, um, but there are three things that we have to do. So now we are emphasizing in the doing part, in the practical part of our divinity. The first one is do no harm. We should not do harm. That's and then he has a list of things that apply in the 18th century. The second one is that we should do good. Actually, he writes that love incites us to do good, um, to in every possibility of every kind, to all people. So we are to do no harm, to do all the good we can, and then to practice the ordinances of God, which in modern times we have translated that as uh, uh, maintain a spiritual life that connects you with God. So the ordinances of God are reading the scriptures, worship, prayer, fasting, abstinence, which is like fasting, um, but it's not accompanied with prayer. Um, Getting together, uh, small groups, Bible study small groups, and things along those lines.
Mhm.
But then the thing that I haven't that excites me the most about all of these different uh, marks of a Methodist is the embracing of um, oh my gosh, it's Friday. The embracing of reason in our faith.
Mm.
So let me explain that. Um, One of the things that John Wesley insisted on was that sometimes churches, ironically, churches and Christians, they get split over tiny little things, um, and he said that it matters that do not pertain to the heart of Christianity. We think and let think. So there is a spirit of tolerance among different doctrines. Um, but think and let think has developed through the years as as thinking Christians. So we think of ourselves as thinking Christians. We often you will hear a Methodist pastor saying that we don't check our brains at the door. So we embrace our faith through reason, uh, through tradition. The tradition of the church is important. Experience. We believe that our experience, God speaks to us through our experience as well. And then the scriptures. The scriptures actually are at the center of this. We call it the quadrilateral. Um, so our experience of God, the way in which we approach God is through these four things. It's reason, tradition, experience, and the scriptures. And the interaction of these four things in each one of our lives should lead us to truly grow in love towards God and towards other people. So I know that I had a litany of things, and I kind of like put them all together because they are all related to each other. Um, but to summarize that last part that I said, the quadrilateral is very important and very distinctively Methodist. Personal piety and social holiness, both are as important as the other. Um, the preeminence of love, and the practical divinity. Those are things that are very distinctively Methodist.
Mhm.
And you may see that in other churches, but the Methodists, we started there. So, um, so that's those are the four things that I would
Mhm,
uh, that will define Methodism
mhm,
or
mhm,
Wesleyan theology.
mhm. If you are just joining us, I am with Reverend Eduardo Busan, who's minister at Nebraska Wesleyan. And really what I'm hearing you bring up is almost the importance of being an activist, it sounds like,
Mm-hmm.
of thinking about faith, reasoning, and then putting that into action. Is that
Mm-hmm.
also kind of a key, which leads us into our discussion of health and wellness as well. But is that fair to say that living out and that experiential component in community is important?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The British Methodists, um, they put together 12 things that John Wesley was concerned about in the 18th century. And they call it John Wesley's Manifesto. Um, I mean, John Wesley did not have a manifesto, but that's how they call it. And these are some more, the practical divinity, the quadrilateral,
Mhm.
um, the preeminence of love, um, the balance between piety and social holiness.
Mhm.
These are some of the things that they came up with. Um, and this comes straight from John Wesley's mouth. To reduce the gap between the rich people and poor people, to help everyone to have a job, to help the poorest, including introducing a living wage, to offer the best possible education, help everyone to feel they can make a difference, to promote tolerance, to promote equal treatment for women, create a society based on values and not on profits and consumerism, and all forms of slavery, avoid getting into wars, care for the environment, share the love of God with everyone. So um, for the early Methodists, social holiness was an extension of our relationship with God. So we could not have one without the other. Um, John Wesley's favorite book of the Bible was the book of James, which oddly enough was Luther's least favorite book of the Bible. Uh, but when John Wesley read from James that faith without works is dead, he really took that to heart. And in his experience of God, he found that it was very true. That if we cannot love our neighbor, how can we say that we love God? Um, and uh, in order to love our neighbor, we have to improve their way of life.
Mhm.
Um, and these are some of the things that he came up with.
Mhm. Nice. And that transitions us so nicely into thinking about intersections of health, wellness, and spirituality. And in our communications, I told Reverend Busan that before I became a scholar of Buddhism, I actually went to seminary for a while at Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley. And I was trying to remember everything I had learned from my classes. And what I recalled is that in the 1700s, before the 18th century, you didn't have a separation in terms of medical care between pastors and doctors. Basically, the term physic, which we get the word physician from, actually would describe somebody who was clergy. And in the handout that I provided everyone, I even included a woodblock print of thinking about how monasteries have always functioned as hospitals. So we've seen that a lot now, right? During COVID, is that churches have functioned in hospitals. And in fact, that's always been the case. And that the New Testament Greek word for healing is the same root as salvation and holiness. Were you proud of my remembrance of Greek? Thanks. So it's just really interesting that connection between spirituality and physicality has always been there, but it's modern times that are separate. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, of that importance of that intersection of health and wellness.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I was really excited to see your notes because for the early Methodists, the circuit riders, these were traveling preachers, and they will go from town to town to town to town to do to preach and administer the sacraments. But they started to find out that there were a lot of sick people, and John Wesley, he was very, of course, very concerned about all these folks that they were reaching out to, and the preacher was supposed to be the most educated person in the village, or in their gatherings. So John Wesley put together, or the early Methodists, I should say, they put together a small library that every secret writer um, will have to take to every town, and some of those included a hymnal, of course, the Bible, and some other writings. And one of those writings, I have a copy here. It's called Wesley's Primitive Physique. This is from 1791, but it was first printed in the 1740s. And it's really cool. In the preface, Wesley writes about how some of these treatments he has learned from as they traveled. They have learned how to treat some things with what was available, resources that were available. He also said, if when you try these treatments once, if they don't work, call the doctor. So it was not getting rid of medicine and doing home remedies, but this was a way of trying to help people. So like I love this. One of the treatments is for a headache. So what should you do if you have a headache? The first treatment is drink water. And which I laughed about it the first time I saw this, but then I remember a few years ago that I was having all these headaches before going to church, before preaching, and I put a Facebook post about it, and some crazy people started telling me that I was being attacked by the devil and things like that. But a friend of mine told me, you may be dehydrated.
Mm.
So I said, I think you're right. So I started drinking water and my headaches disappeared.
Interesting.
Who knew? Wesley was right.
Yeah.
They are all sort of remedies here, because it was important for not just for the soul to be made well, but for the body. If the body's not well, the soul is not well, and if the soul is not well, the body's not well. So since then, Methodists, we talk a lot about Methodists being involved in education and how important education was for the early Methodists and still for Methodists today. But healthcare was as much as well. Was very important than as it is now.
And something that just occurred to me, of linking it back to what you're talking about, the importance of reason within Methodism, that we've all experienced when you haven't been well physically, that your mind isn't as sharp and clear. And so that also then leads me to think that intersection is so natural, because you need to take care of your body so that your mind can reason, because that's part of the spiritual process as well.
Exactly. Yeah. If we experience God through our reason, and we're ill and we cannot do that, our mind is not straight in that sense. Then we cannot experience God. So it's both the body and the soul go together in Wesleyan spirituality.
Interesting. Very interesting. We'll begin to open this up to audience questions in about 10 minutes, but I have a few things I've been wondering about. One of them is a program that I was reading about, the Healthy Congregations program, which is a network of Great Plains UMC churches that are focusing on health in their community. So one of the concerns has been healthcare. And so I was thinking about what you were talking about, of not just being the individual, but also then living out and living in society. Can you talk a little bit about that activism, including healthcare activism?
Well, yes. one thing is for us to say everyone should be educated or everyone should have health care, but then um, when people come to say, so what do I do? For us, I don't know. I'm just telling you that you need to have good healthcare. That's not a Christian way of doing things. So we have invested in in healthcare. For example, we began since 1908. Methodist, they put together a social creed that was later revised. When was it revised? In the last 30 years. And in healthcare is one of those things that we believe that every single person has the right to have appropriate healthcare. So one way to go about it is investing in hospitals. Um, we started a hospital in Omaha, Methodist, and throughout the nation in big cities, you will see that there will be hospitals that either are still related or at some point began by Methodists. But the initiative of health congregations has to do with preventative care. So one of the things, we gave everyone a step counter when those things were all the rage. Um, so for people to do exercise um, and then we will compete against churches and we will get certificates and things along those lines. But it is the idea that we need to care for our folks and for their physical health in before they go to the hospital, because um, uh, by expanding um, our well-being and we may be able to avoid some of those illnesses that will take us to the hospitals. So I hope this is making sense. I think it's making sense in my head.
Yeah. Well,
So
what I'm hearing is that
mhm,
really the church's role is it's not compartmentalized with every person. It's spiritual health in all ways, that it's physical,
mhm.
it's mental, and that's also spiritual. And so if you leave one of those components behind, then that's not really caring for the whole being. Is that safe to say?
Right, right. We have to care for the whole being. Um, we also have a very robust um, theology of creation, um, which intersects with this, right? Because we are part of creation, so we're caring for ourselves. Um, but caring for ourselves is also caring um, for water, for to try to reduce pollution, to put pressure on companies who might be um, uh, not paying good salaries or fair salaries to their workers. So when we all are healthy, if one of us is ill, all of us are ill.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so we need to be invested in that in the caring of creation, which includes the individual's own health, spiritual and physical health.
So there's that collective component, which then extends into environmental health. And I'm so glad that you brought that up, because that's actually one component that I haven't touched on with other speakers yet in the series, is that importance of that health and wellness and spirituality is also related to the environment. Are there
Mhm.
particular initiatives that you said thinking about water and putting pressure on companies? Are there other kinds of initiatives that you've seen churches get involved in that are really concerned about climate change and environmental health?
Yeah. Well, the the church that I go to here in Lincoln is a very small church. kind of like in the middle of town. And one of the things that um, we wanted to start a community garden.
Mhm.
Um, and because we have a lot of space in our church, but then just a few blocks there was a community garden, um, and we started partnering with them, and since our partnership, that garden has grown to, excuse me, um, to also include um, many of the neighbors around the gardens. So it is a very diverse neighborhood. So now we have people from the Middle East and from Africa um, from Lincoln. We're all gardening together. And of course, eating our own things, but we're gardening together and caring for air. We're actually getting our hands dirty together in making a space that otherwise would have been a parking lot into a beautiful space of sustenance. In Omaha, we have what is called the Big Garden, which is a nonprofit that helps communities, give grants to communities and institutions uh, to be involved in sustainable gardening, and um, those are ways in which we, um, on a very local level, at the ground level, we are able uh, to care for the environment,
Mhm.
um, in, you know, and to care for one another.
Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm.
but at the macro level, a few years ago, we called for a boycott of Taco Bell,
Mhm.
which, whew, for some people that was hard. Um, but it was the idea that their tomatoes, they were not paying a fair wage to the workers that picked up tomatoes. So we called for a boycott, and it was not just us. The Presbyterians did that too. And so we did it together with other. And when we come together, all of a sudden, um, Taco Bell begins to raise wages.
Mhm. Wow.
Um, we have divested from fossil fuels,
Mhm.
and invested in renewable energy sources. So um, it's a very diverse church
Mhm.
and very democratic in its polity. But we do the best, as much as we can together,
Mhm.
um, to to make a difference,
Mhm.
to care for creation.
Mhm. That's fantastic. And I was talking about just really that, how do you come together as a community, and that shared necessity of food and wellness and health,
Mm-hmm.
um and that really leads me into thinking about, especially in the past year, in a time of social isolationism, how have churches responded to care for mental health, because that's been such a big concern of people being alone. What are some things that you've been seeing?
Um, not it's funny. I'm gonna say not much, but I think that every pastor feels like haven't done enough, because we really don't know exactly what needs to be done.
Right.
Um, so like pastoral visits are have to be at a distance now. So
Mhm.
we've had pastors doing um, um, porch visits. So they will
Mhm.
call their parishioners, and they will be in their porch, or equivalent area, and the pastors will be on the sidewalk, um, or at least 6 feet apart, and do visits that way. Um, so that's one example of one of the ways that we have been coping.
Mhm.
Um, the we have many people who are able to communicate through Zoom, but not everyone is able to do that. So, how do we reach out to shut-ins? How do we make community in a way that people like Peter Block didn't never ever thought about community being formed, and it's a big question. Uh, the church doesn't have a good track. And by the church, I mean every church, but let me just talk about the United Methodist Church. We don't have a good track record with dealing with mental health in general. I think we're much better than we were 10, 15 years ago. But we're still trying to figure out how are we in ministry um, with folks that need mental health care, um, emotional care, because they're also part of God's creation. So it's an area of growth for us. Um, pastors are going crazy because pastors are very relational, and not being able to shake hands on a Sunday morning, preaching to, like in church I go, there's no space for maybe 10 people in the sanctuary. Um, so it's hard. It's very difficult, and for pastors it has also been a very difficult time emotionally. Um, so that is a great question that I don't have a good answer yet, even though I've been talking for the last 5 minutes about it.
It's a heavy.
I'm a pastor.
Yeah, it's a heavy responsibility right now of, just especially if, everything that you've brought up is that the concern is really about ministering to the whole self. And so when you cannot be together physically, how do you meet people? And then, it's challenging sometimes for folks to jump on Zoom if they have children running around, all these things. And so just constantly missing each other. And so I was imagining too, as you're talking, the importance of self-care for pastors as well, that it's such a burden for them too. A joyful burden, of course, and a blessing, but it's just so much that they need to attend to. And it's a heavy time. But like you said, maybe this is an area of growth to kind of think about how to care for mental health. I do want to make sure that if any audience members begin to have questions, I of course have more questions, but if anyone has questions, feel free to put them in the chat or to ask them live. But while people are thinking about questions that they have, if you want to ask some questions in the chat, part of this series is we really want to continue to increase inclusivity on campus and our campus spaces. And it's so wonderful that you are a campus minister because you're in that space. And I was wondering, from your experiences, what strategies have you found to be effective for building inclusivity on campus?
Having conversation. That is really the best strategy. We've partnered with the Interfaith Youth Corps, IFYC, to look at ways in which we can be more inclusive of students of other faith traditions on campus. I mean, we are a United Methodist related institution, but we have students here from every faith tradition. So how do we make them feel welcome? How to help them feel that they belong? How do we care for them as part of creation? And I foresee they've been doing a lot of work with this and throughout the years, and they insist that there are practices that we need to that we need to observe. One is to create an environment in which people can tell their own story. And that also assumes that other people will want to listen and not debate, right? And then from telling your own story, that moves to being able to have meaningful conversations. And the final step is people being able to, of different traditions, build enough social capital to make a difference. So um, I tell my story, I dialogue with you, you tell your story, I learn from you, and then we can serve together and build social capital that way. Um, so I think the best way to increase our inclusivity on campus is to create spaces where we can have conversations where people from different traditions, people from different points of view are able to come together and have honest conversations, knowing that I'm not trying to convert you, you're not trying to convert me. I'm just sharing who I am, and there is something really beautiful and powerful about that exercise. Um, uh, Telling different stories and not trying to win an argument.
Right.
What?
Right. No, so lovely of thinking about in the classroom of creating opportunities for students to story tell, but setting the parameters, right? That we're here to share, we're here to learn, not here to judge, not here to compare, and across all campus life of creating those opportunities just to have that space, that space for listening, rather than space for judging or trying to like you said, say argue a particular point.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
nice.
Danvers, I think I said compatriots. So, oh no, I misspelled it. Compatriots. There we go. Which is that we are both from Puerto Rico. Though the way that you typed it reminded me to another word that is compadre, which is um, it's um, a compadre is someone. It's uh, two people who share. Oh my gosh, why is this so difficult to explain? Two people who share the responsibility of raising a child. So, like, so for example, my godfather will be my dad's compadre. Uh, Me as the godfather of my niece, I am my my brother-in-law's compadre. So,
Interesting.
are Puerto Ricans also Latinos or Hispanics? Ooh, it depends. People differ on this so much. If we are in the mainland in the United States, we're considered Hispanics. If we are in Puerto Rico, even though it's part of the United States, if we're in Puerto Rico, we're considered Latinos. I don't like labels, so I'm a Puerto Rican. um, so, but that's the answer to that. Thank you for asking.
If anyone has any other questions, please continue to send them our way. You've given us so much already to think about that openness and being as a companion with your neighbor, and really this importance of activism. And one kind of final thought I had is, and this also gives some folks some more time to kind of think about any other questions they have, is sometimes to create safe space for sharing and inclusivity in the classroom and other spaces is we need to have times of healing, right? So sometimes we just need to have opportunities for healing. Can you talk a little bit about healing from your experience as a minister, or from the United Methodist Church perspective? Just kind of what is your sense of best practices for healing, or healing services even that are present?
Sure. The An ancient word for priest in Latin would be curate. Uh, in Spanish, we say cura, which means healer. So clergy even the Middle Ages were considered healers of people. And Courtney, I love what you said. Not just healers of the body, but also healers of the soul, um, because that's the word for salvation in Greek means both healing and salvation. So we do have healing services. Christianity, uh, the more charismatic versions of Christianity believe um, in faith healing, and I'm sure that you all have heard about that. So sometimes uh, I acknowledge that some people, very few people, may have a gift like that. Um, that they pray for people and somehow they are healed. The New Testament speaks about that too. But it is more, um, uh, but in truth, healing in how healing occurs in the church, it's seen within a physical, spiritual, emotional context. So um, we have a ritual in the United Methodist Church for healing services. And this is a service where people who need healing, um, they come, and uh, all the acts of worship, the prayers, the sermon, the singing, it all it's all geared towards healing, um, and again healing as both emotional, physical, and spiritual healing. And at the end of the service, we pray for people, we anoint people with oil. Anointing, is both in Christian theology, is a manifestation of the Holy Spirit. So when we're healing someone, it is as the Holy Spirit coming into that person. But in the Hebrew scriptures, we also see um, anointing as a setting apart of someone. So so we anoint people with oil, and we pray for people. And I've been at many of those, and it's a powerful experience for these folks, that they're seeking for comfort from God in the midst of their very difficult circumstance. And the church is right there to help them to deal with um, those feelings. And in the in their experience, healing happens. Now, when I say healing, please understand that it is not physical healing, but it is their experience of God becomes more real, and that's um, where they experience wholeness.
When I was thinking too, that, the sense of like holiness of being made whole, right? Of kind of
Right.
recognizing the pain, creating opportunity to to allow that pain to manifest so that you can heal it and to become whole. And I was thinking about how, as you're talking about, how important that'll be post-COVID, right? Like how
Hmm.
the big role that churches will have and all faith communities will have, and really kind of sense of creating opportunities, time for healing, so that
Yeah.
people can then start sharing their stories and build that inclusive environment again. Um,
Hmm.
it'll be a lot, I think, but maybe pastors, they'll be excited to to kind of embrace
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
congregation again. But even on campus and classrooms, I was thinking too, the opportunity that maybe that's kind of a strategy that we can all think about is creating that space to acknowledge the pain, and creating that space then so that there is openness and dialogue of sharing stories, so that people can feel like they're really being brought into an inclusive space.
Yeah. Well, and we don't have many spaces that ritualize
Mhm.
pain in our
Right.
in our culture.
Mhm.
So being able to open and make spaces for people to express their pain,
Mhm.
it's very powerful, and that is the beginning of wholeness, of
Mhm.
healing.
Mhm.
Um, and that's what the healing services are trying to offer,
Interesting.
or
Interesting.
were designed to offer.
Interesting. We've given us so much to think about of this intersection of the mind and the body and spirit, and there are a few. We're not right at one. There's a few more minutes left if anyone wants to ask any questions. But
Hmm.
yeah, I'm really kind of left thinking about what you're talking about just there. This kind of creating space, and I studied Taoism before I studied Buddhism, and there was always this sense that the space of a pot is what gives it meaning more so than what you put in it. And so it's just that's the
Yeah,
image that kept coming to mind as you were talking, of just create that
yeah.
space for sharing, for healing.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Phip asked me a question
Yeah.
related uh, to church attendance going down, and in the United States it is. In other parts of the world, it's not. I think you asked me, what do you think about that? And I have so many thoughts about it. Um, but I think that the church, in my work with young people who want to be leaders in the church, um, it tells me that the church is changing, is shifting. Um, and if I was a Methodist, I will bet that in 50 years, um, the church will look very different than the way that it looks now. But since I'm Methodist, I cannot bet. Um, Gambling is against our rules. Uh, but I think that what it means is that the church is shifting, is changing, and we're going to see more smaller communities, more neighborhood expressions of church. Not so much brick and mortar, but more community of people giving themselves to social change in their own in the local communities. Um, and I say that not out of wishful thinking, but it's more out of what I'm seeing my students wanting to do when they graduate. That's and they want to lead the church. That's what they want to do. They want to be community organizers, basically, and that's really exciting for clergy to become that. To a degree, I think it mirrors um, what those early circuit riders were doing um, in the 18th century. So
Wandering around and responding, it sounds like civic
yeah,
activists, really.
exactly,
That's interesting.
exactly.
Are
Thank you
there
for the
any
question.
are there any other questions from the audience at all? Not. If anyone has any more questions, I will say that on the handout there's some more links of I pulled together some various interfaith communities and communities from across various religious traditions that are engaged in activism. And Reverend Busan, do you mind if people have more questions, if we contact you at all?
Oh, please, I'm just dropping my email address on the chat.
Oh, great,
Uh,
perfect.
so please, oh my gosh, if you have any question about anything that we've been talking about today, or about anything else that has to do with Christianity or Methodism, please let me know, and I would love to.
Wonderful.
I would love to interact, to chat with you, to visit with you about that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who came. And if you have a question, any lingering questions, please feel free to ask them. In 2 weeks, we will be talking about Buddhism. And then 2 weeks after that is our last one talking about Hinduism.